Well, we move on. This is great.
On, right?
Yeah, this is move on. For those of you that might just be joining us, you're a part of the America's Future series, as you see behind David. David is the CEO and the founder of this incredible organization. National Security, Cyber, Land, Air, Sea, and Space Symposium. That's what we're talking about today, and we have people from literally all over the United States as a part of what we're sharing with each and every one of you today. So it's our security, it's our future, it's what we are all about and what we need to be aware of. So thank you. If you've just tuned in, and for those of you that joined us earlier this morning, we again remind you, we're going to be here till later this afternoon, about 4, 5, 6 o'clock. So stay on board.
Yep, stay tuned and invite your friends. Let people know they can still register. We put the link on our homepage and on the event page, so that if you can't find it, it's right there. Right, trying to make it simple.
Yeah,
and and we probably have another 10, 12 countries where people are tuning in. So this is an international.
Yeah, this is
program.
very exciting.
So I know it's about 2 a.m. their time, but hey, we appreciate their being part of this.
Go for it.
Tell your friends.
Yeah, you got it. Well, what do we got upcoming now? Let's see.
I think we want to bring back our good friend Rear Admiral Paul Becker.
Oh, we do. Yes, indeed, we do. Is he there?
I'm back with you.
He
if
is.
you could please enable my video.
We don't see a face, but we hear a voice.
Fearless leader.
And that's a good. There he is.
Now I'm back.
Well, we're delighted to welcome you back again. Thanks so much for being a part of this today. You're such an integral part, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, shipmates. On the Marine Corps birthday, it's my honor to introduce the moderator for the next panel. This is former Marine Lieutenant General Laurie Reynolds. Laurie, like myself, a Naval Academy graduate. She's from the illustrious class of 1986, which the illustrious class of 1983 is very proud of, that we trained and enabled them so well to achieve everything that she's done in her career. Most recently, she was the first Deputy Commandant of the Marine Corps for Information. And in that role, she was responsible for digital technology, space, and cyberspace. She's not just a DC Marine. She's a combat veteran of both the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns. Also a fellow Ellis Island Medal of Honor winner and the initial recipient of the National Defense University's and Admiral Grace Hopper Award just last year. So Laurie, over to you. Happy birthday and Semper Fi.
Well, Becker, thank you. And really thank you to America's Future Series for the opportunity to be a small part of this really important discussion. To all the Marines out there, happy birthday. It's 246 years serving our nation. And so just really proud to have been a part of that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's really my honor today to be a small part of a discussion where we're going to have the Chief Executive Officer for Blue Voyant, Mr. Jim Rosenthal, and Admiral Mike Mullen join me in a panel discussion about the opportunities and challenges in the defense industrial base from a cybersecurity perspective. And so Jim and Admiral Mullen, thank you for being here today, gentlemen. I know you're both in New York, and really appreciate you making time for this really, I think, important conversation. So, look, I think what I wanted to just do is begin this discussion with just a little bit of context for the audience. First and foremost, I think most generally an acknowledgement of the increasing importance of cybersecurity to our national security. And here I'll just say that cyber really forces us to think very differently about national security, because an attacker bypasses every physical security element that we've ever had, those things that have protected our nation for so long. And so it really forces you to think differently about security, about our national security. So I thought I would just, for context, start very briefly with the opportunities and maybe a few challenges, and then I'm going to turn it over to the folks, to Jim and Admiral Mullen for their thoughts. First, on the opportunity side, I think as we look across the landscape, increasing partnerships at the U.S. government level. We see the Cybersecurity Coordination Center right outside NSA, where we have industry and NSA working together. We have CMMC 2.0, which has kind of reduced the entry, if you will, for industry into the DoD and the DIB I think the spirit of innovation and the skills that we have here in the United States, we're certainly up to the challenge. Increased awareness, I think. Of course, we're forced to be aware with things like Colonial Pipeline and solar winds and so forth. So really kind of a wake-up call. Then on the challenges side, gentlemen, I think, the threat is certainly increasing. The cost to participate in cyber attacks is low. Old processes, maybe a policy that needs to be continually refined. And then this whole idea of a culture of compliance as opposed to a culture of constant interaction or things that maybe need to be addressed. So with that context, let me turn it over first to Joe, or I'm sorry, to Jim Rosenthal. And sir, what are your opening comments on this idea about opportunities and challenges for the DIB?
I think that, hi everyone, I'm Jim Rosenthal, I'm the CEO of Blue Voyant. And I wanted to talk a bit, Laurie, to your point about just the nature of the threat and how that seems to be increasing. And then with Admiral Mullen, I'll talk about some of the things that we can do to address that. But just to size it, cybercrime is now, by far the predominant form of crime in the world, and it's growing pretty rapidly. So in 2018, estimates vary, but a good midpoint estimate would be $500 billion in monetary damage from cybercrime. In 2020, a good estimate would be $1 trillion or more. So it's doubled across those 2 years. And there's some other indications that support the fact that it's growing that rapidly. The highest ransom paid to a cyber criminal in 2019 was $5 million. In 2020, it doubled to $10 million. And in 2021, it's $40 million. And the average ransom paid, even by a medium-sized company, was $115,000 in 2019, over $300,000 in 2020. So by any measure, the cybercrime that the defense industrial base needs to be concerned about has the traditional nation state concern of stealing intellectual property, and also has got the concern of disruption to production because of cybercrime down the supply chains. So objectively, the challenge that we're collectively facing has been growing in a pretty significant way. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about how I see addressing that challenge, but I'd like to turn over to Admiral Mullen now for his opening thoughts.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Laurie, and happy birthday, Laurie, to you and all the Marines around the world. This is always a very special day. And thanks for, this forum to be able to talk about what I consider to be, one of 2 or 3 existential threats to the United States, and that's cyber. And that's something I've been focused on for 15 years now. And it is, even as Laurie sort of sets the table for the requirements for public-private and for leadership engagement, it's been that way for 15 plus years that I can see. And there still is not, from my perspective, the sense of urgency to address this threat as it continues to evolve. And 15 years ago, Russia was the leader with respect to the threat. China was evolving, and China has now evolved to a technical level that certainly bodes very poorly in terms of outcomes for us unless we do something about it, and particularly for the defense industrial base. And I saw just briefly on the last panel, Ellen Lord, though I didn't hear everything she said, but Ellen and others took significant steps to try to figure out how to defend this defense industrial base. It is alive and well, and the threat is alive and well, and it's pretty thin in terms of its defense in many places, and we know that. We'll probably talk a little bit more about this compliance approach, but generally, the way I see compliance, it's almost table stakes, it's minimums. It really is not gonna, it's gonna help move us in the right direction, but we need to be way beyond that, and we need to figure out how to work together to get beyond that in that industrial base that we're talking about here. I have said for a number of years, and nothing's changed, and I've seen it in the government and I've seen it in the private sector. You know, the key to, as it is almost in any area we know, the key to getting this right is going to be leadership. It's going to be leaders. It's going to be leaders who, one, understand the threat, two, are willing to commit their resources and spend time on it, three, that they will in fact make decisions to hire the right people with an understanding of what that means technically, and that is also can be that aspect of it is what is the technology here? Why are we so concerned? To hire people that understand that, but be engaged with them, not just hire a technical expert and you think everything, therefore everything will be okay. And then obviously writing the policies, and the policies that we've struggled with in the government for the last 20 years with respect to this, you know, continue to evolve. Who's in charge? Who's in charge of what? Who's in charge of what, when? How do we work together as a government to handle this increasing threat that really is existential? The Congress is a part of that. Obviously, the executive branch is a part of that, and inside that, certainly the Pentagon. But the Pentagon we can make significant progress on the DIB in terms of its protection, but because of the connectivity that the DIB has to the outside world in both the U.S. as well as globally, there are limits in terms of how much progress we can actually make. So in addition to leaders, longer term, actually, it needs to happen as fast as possible, but longer term, there has to be a very robust public-private commitment to get this right, to handle this threat. And that's, we've had challenges with that. There have been private companies that, you know, major private companies that have been burned by that. And I understand that. But I think we've got to figure out through leader to leader engagement, how do we engage each other on this so that we can create the kind of security structure that really protects us, not just now, but well into the future. And what many of you know this because you're working the future programs and the future POMs and the future budget. But I mean, what we're doing now or not doing now impacts 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. And in that regard, I worry a little bit about us being behind. And we've got a mindset to do that. I mean, that's sort of how we live. But how do we do it? And then how in the constant challenge that we've had to try to get acquisition right, how do we make good decisions inside the building, if you will, that are consistent with creating good businesses who can actually grow and become incredibly reliable partners in this area, but as well as any other. And then lastly, I'd say I worry a little bit that companies small companies in particular, they're just sort of keeping their fingers crossed and they're hoping that they're not a target. And that's just not going to work. It's not going to work in the long time. CMMC starts to get at some of that, but it just isn't going to work because the enemy is, and we'll talk a little bit more about the threat, but the enemy is really good at finding the holes, and you don't need many holes. In fact, to get into the network, you just need one. And that's what we have to protect against. And that's what I hope we can talk a little bit about today, and that we can get a whole lot better.
Admiral, thank you. So you just brought up, as I think through people, process, technology, I mean, there's something there for everyone from a cybersecurity perspective. I think, my question next would be for Jim, though, is, I know that you have done a lot of study on the DIB and some of the challenges. Do you see any best practices out there in the DIB or in the DoD or recommendations based on the experience of your, the work that your company has done, sir?
Sure, thank you. And the answer is yes. So to put it into perspective, Laurie, one of the things we do at Blue Voyant is every year survey 1,200 companies, including a number in the DIB, but in every industry, the CIOs, the CISOs, and CPOs about what is happening with respect to cybersecurity and supply chains. And one of the findings this year was that 97% of the companies, so essentially all of them, were impacted by a cyber breach somewhere in their supply chain. And on average, this year, that was 3.7 times, as opposed to last year when it was 2.7 times. So to Admiral Mullen's point, the threat is growing in every way. And it's a threat both of loss of intellectual property and of disruption. Now, the good news is priorities are changing in response to this. And so too, actions will need to accompany that change of priorities. So to give you a sense of it, last year, 31% of those companies said that cybersecurity in the supply chain wasn't a priority for them, was not a priority. That's not good. This year, it's only 13%. So there's been a pretty dramatic shift, right, to focusing on supply chain security all the way down the supply chain. The second thing that's changed is, and it's pretty interesting, when we asked companies how many suppliers they had in their supply chain, the number of companies last year that told us it was between 1,000 and 10,000 was 14%, not that many. When we asked the same question, essentially the same companies this year, 31% said that they had between 1,000 and 10,000 suppliers. That means that visibility into who are the constituent parts of the supply chain is increasing in response to increased focus on it. And the third thing that's happening that is a good development is when we ask companies this year, how much money were they spending on defending cyber defense of their supply chain? And how was that planned to change in the next coming year? We asked that question last year, and last year, 50% of the companies told us they were planning on increasing their budgets for supply chain cyber defense by 50% or more. We asked the same question this year, 60% of the companies told us that they were planning on increasing their budgets for supply chain defense by 60% or more. So the good news is awareness is increasing in response to the threat increasing. Resources and focus are increasing in response to the threat. And now the question becomes, what do you do? And the answer in any good cyber defense is you need multiple layers of defense because any single layer is not sufficient. So CMMC has been a terrific step forward, and CMMC 2.0 will be an even better step to essentially make sure that the overall processes in a supplier, right, are improving in a significant way. But CMMC is not sufficient. CMMC happens periodically, and it doesn't give you a current view of what actually vulnerabilities are that an attacker would see. Now, inside Blue Voyant, we've got a number of personnel who formerly worked at the NSA or the FBI or other agencies like that, and a number of them are former attackers. And what they will say uniformly is that when they were looking at penetrating an adversary, they would look at the supply chain first if it wasn't easy to get in directly. And in the supply chain, they would look for easy targets. Now, to defend against that requires several layers of defense. It requires CMMC, it requires questionnaires of suppliers, it requires periodic audits of suppliers, but very importantly, it also requires now continuous monitoring to see that there's no externally facing, visible to an attacker, easy vulnerability for compromise. With layering those layers of defense, one can get to, the new improved version necessary in a world in which the technology of the attackers, to Admiral Mullen's point, has significantly improved over the last couple of years, and we on the defensive side need to keep moving with it. So let me pause at that and ask Admiral Mullen for his thoughts.
Jim, as I listen to that, I mean, one of the things that was very true actually when I was on active duty, when cyber was just beginning, and I go back to my personal experience, goes back to, the Russians in 2008, and even I've seen it in the private sector is, and let me go back to, in the military, when we were starting to stand up Cyber Command, and when we were asking the service chiefs to carve out of their budget X number of dollars to create the FTEs, the slots, if you will, for people. It was really painful. And in particular, the service chiefs saw this as something that they would carve out. It would almost go joint, and they'd never pay for it, train them, and then they'd never see them again. That's hard. That just goes hard against our culture in all of the services. In the civilian sector, what I've seen is this is going to cost us more money. We're going to have to invest in systems. We're going to have to integrate this as we go, as opposed to if it's a problem down the road, when we get our system out there, we'll fix it then. And embedding, and I've seen that in the acquisition system inside the building as well. And my own view is you have to write this in early, and you have to, and leaders have to do this, because I don't think the middle management, I don't think the individual program managers who are held to account for schedule and budget, et cetera, will readily do that within their budget unless they've got the kind of cover that a leader can provide. Say, we're going to do this, and it's a longer term return. It's a much better return. Certainly, you assume if you assume nothing happens, then you sort of have beat the bet, if you will, if you don't do it. But these days, the likelihood you're going to beat the bet is just going down and down and down. It's not a matter of if you're going to get breached. It's a matter of when you get breached. And then that costs you a whole lot more money at that point, and a whole lot more effort at that point to write it in than it does from the beginning. But our culture is to not write it in at the beginning. That's the way it is in the acquisition programs. Therefore, that's the way it is in the DIB. The same is true on the outside, that I've seen, major companies which, basically have the same kind of thing. How do you get the culture to do this up front? That's, and all that entails. And who do you listen to, and who are the smart people that can tell you this is how we ought to do it, and then stay with it? That's really key. And then lastly, I'd say, and this focuses on China, but in 2006, I was head of the Navy. I was asking my team, my 3-star team, to talk to me about, a war plan with Iran specifically. And I turned to my then N6, or I said, okay, so tell me how this starts. And my then N6 said to me, he looked at me and goes, the war's already started. They're already into us in information warfare. That's what we called it back then, or C4ISR. So it's on. It's not a declared war, but it's on, and it's serious, and it's existential. And we've given China in particular, as we have in so many areas, runway for years to get ahead of us, if you will, or get as far down that road as possible. So it is really urgent we stop them now. And the DIB and its security, I worry greatly how penetrated we are, how much IP we've given away. The session before us talked about just buying a little equity in a small company, paying off the owner, and now they own the IP. The Chinese own the IP. That scares me to death. So I hope, if nothing else, we're finally waking up.
Yeah, may I pick up on that point a bit? Because to Ed Ramon's point, the threat's been with us for a long time. The action of the nation state adversaries has been with us for a long time. But one of the things that's been accelerating lately has been the prevalence of widely present software vulnerabilities that broadly affect different constituent parts of the supply chain. And look, I'm a private sector guy. I was, COO of Morgan Stanley before I started Blue Voyant. I was a leader in financial services and cybersecurity for a decade before that. And I'm very familiar in the difference in resources available to a large company versus a small company. So large companies, whether it be in the defense industrial base or anywhere else, tend to have, if they're focused on cyber, very active, very good cyber defenses. So I'm sure that's true of the prime contractors in financial services, it's true of the big banks. And to give you a sense of scale, at Morgan Stanley, we would spend $400 million a year on cyber defense. If you spend $400 million a year in cyber defense, and if you have the right people working it, you can have very good cyber defense. On the other hand, I'm very familiar with the smaller banks, and this is true of the smaller manufacturers as well that spend, aren't able to spend very much money on cyber defense and aren't able to attract the right experts. And our supply chains in the DIB contain, all the way down a mixture of large, well-defended companies and medium-sized and smaller ones who may not have the same capabilities. And in a world in which once a month on average, there's a new zero-day vulnerability, usually coming from software that's widely deployed. And by zero day, I mean a new critical vulnerability that can lead to serious systems compromise, and that's externally perceivable. The burden on quick defense and quick defensive reactions to patch things like that is only increasing. And I think that as we think holistically about the DIB, we've got to, come up with an overall approach that has CMMC working all the way down, and that has a form of continuous, near real-time protection deployed against the new zero-day vulnerabilities that are happening up and down that chain. Some of whom will respond well to it and quickly, and some of whom need help in order to do that.
So Jim, if I can just pull a thread on what you just said. So this is the second time you've mentioned this idea of continuous monitoring, which I think we can all agree that a static compliance-based model is completely insufficient to the challenge that we have today. What is the right model for continuous monitoring for those companies that can't afford to provide their own, or are you suggesting that the primes are responsible for continuous monitoring through their supply chains, or how do you see that working? And then for you, Admiral Mullen, given your time as the chairman, how do you incentivize a culture of readiness in cyberspace as opposed to compliance, which is what we're so used to? So two sides of the same coin. Over.
Okay, I'll go first. I do think it's important up and down the supply chain for the primes, for the military services, to have visibility all the way down the supply chain and to have visibility into the state of its both overall cybersecurity and particular defense against newly discovered things in the world on a continuous basis. That can be achieved in a number of ways. It's kind of everybody's responsibility at each level. So it's a shared responsibility. And either a company is capable of doing that on its own, or it can externally look for private sector partners to do it for that. Same is true for the defense of the DIB itself, the direct defense, because some companies at some scale can do a wonderful job. Other companies need to be encouraged to go to the private sector to do it for them, which can be more economically efficient and perhaps more cyber defensively efficient as well. So I think it's everybody's shared responsibility. But Admiral Mullen, what's your view?
Just a couple of thoughts. One is when I think about the supply chain, which is, I can't remember, 3 years ago, it wasn't much talked of, or maybe it was 2 years ago. And now for lots of reasons, not least of which it's being shorted around the world and having a huge economic impact, that there's a lot better understanding. But still, I believe when people talking about supply chain, I want them to say to me, okay, tell me what your supply chain is. Lay it out. Show me a diagram, a physical diagram of what your supply chain is. We have to understand that better specifically. And I know, honestly, at the senior level in the Pentagon, that's just never done. I mean, that's done sort of a subset in the acquisition world. But at the leadership level, you never see it. That might be changing just because of the vulnerability on the one hand. But there's also a network supply chain, if you will. So if I took that same physical laydown and then I laid out the networks that were in on that, the companies, each of their networks, what I have found in the last several years is most companies have no idea who's in their network and how far their network extends far beyond what they're able to see with their own cybersecurity network or information security network. There are a lot of, because of the vulnerabilities, and there are ways to do that. So one is what are we really talking about here? I think that's really important. What do we mean by the supply chain? And then what's the network of that supply chain look like? And then what do we do about it? And how do we defend it, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other, though, which comes at least from a model standpoint, that makes a lot of sense to me on the continuous monitoring, Laurie, is, we've all grown up in the military. We've all grown up in watch centers or command centers or combat information centers, or, whatever the case might be. Those watch centers, and they have their moments, they are very intense and they are very quiet, but they are constantly manned, constantly monitored. They have tripwires that start to, hey, say, we're in trouble, we need to do anything. To me, as I look at and have started to try to understand and all cards on the table, I run the advisory board for Blue Voyant, and I really joined Blue Voyant because this threat really concerns me, quite frankly, at the strategic level. What I have learned is, at least in my lingo, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a watch center. We're talking about a command center. We're talking about constant monitoring so you can move quickly. That's why, CMMC every 3 years, again, it's table stakes, but that's not going to get you, that's not going to give you any response, any capability whatsoever to respond quickly. How do you do that? And how can we do it at the most efficient, effective way? Minimal cost, if you will. But when I say minimal, I use that term guardedly, because it isn't just $100. If you need to spend $1,000, you should spend $1,000, because the downstream side of that, if you get that wrong, is a lot more than $1,000, or whatever the case might be. So that's kind of how I think about this. And part of the challenge for at least from a former military guy to the private sector, is that kind of command center, constant monitoring. That isn't how the private sector grew up, if you will. And so now that's a huge difference. And I think that has to be integrated, if you will. And you can do it yourself, stand your own center up, or you can obviously hire somebody to do that for you. Those are decisions that need to be made.
May I pick up on that for a second, Laurie? Since I'm a private sector guy, I'm always interested in, why would it be that some medium-sized supplier in the defense industrial base wouldn't patch something that's clearly vulnerable as quickly as possible? And just factually, we've got very good visibility across 1 million companies, and so in all sectors. And typically in a sector, you'll see about half of the companies react very rapidly to fix and protect. And you'll see, meaning they'll do it within a week, sometimes within 24 hours of something new that's dangerous in the world being discovered. But you see the other half not doing it for 30 days or more, maybe not at all. And why does that happen? It doesn't happen because of bad faith. Typically, it happens because of lack of visibility and lack of understanding. So to give you an example, because we do this for clients, for one of the more recent zero-day events, we notified a typical supplier that they had it. It was ServU, owned by SolarWinds. So it's not the original SolarWinds attack. It actually is the second one that exploited a company owned by SolarWinds. And the company responded to us when we notified them within 4 hours of the world discovering it, that they didn't have it. We said, yes, you do. And they said back to us the next day, no, we don't. We fixed SolarWinds 3 months ago. We no longer have SolarWinds in our system. And we said, no, this isn't the original SolarWinds. This is SolarWinds version 2, which is called ServU, a subsidiary owned by SolarWinds. And they said, well, we don't have that either. And then the next day, we sent them a picture of what we could see from the outside to show them that they had it. And then they said, oh, we do. And we gave them the patch and they fixed it. Now that was, good faith. They wanted to do the right thing all along. They just don't have perfect visibility inside their network to see what they've got. So behaviorally, I think that all of the actors are actually usually motivated by all the right motivations. We need to collectively provide them with the right information and command center type alerting so that they can take action to protect themselves very quickly. So as you can tell, I'm an optimist. I think that we've got those capabilities now exist at scale in the private sector, and the need exists and the will to protect oneself exists. We just need to wire it all together in a way that's visible up and down and works both in the long run by having the right processes as per CMMC and the right, action tactically quickly when required.
I really appreciate that comment, because I think what we see all of the services doing right now in the Pentagon, certainly, before I retired, was really getting our networks ready for all of our networks were built as an administrative tool, not necessarily a command and control capability, whether you're commanding from the Pentagon or out at the tactical edge. And so what you see all the services doing right now, I think, is readying for the fight and better understanding exactly what am I dealing with, how many domains, how do I flatten the surface area for attack. And so that's the transition that we see, I think, happening in the building is that idea that the network is a weapon system. I guess, just a final question for both of you would be, it's one thing to kind of establish the right framework for cybersecurity acquisition and then being able to sustain that, from here on out. I guess, what are your thoughts on fielded systems, maybe that have, so fielded operational technology, if you will, that have dormant supply chains, things like that. So, what are your thoughts on things like that, where, we may not even have project managers anymore for some of these capabilities? Any thoughts on that as we just close this conversation out?
Let me defer to Admiral Mullen.
So I didn't answer your question on readiness, Laurie, and I'll start answering that and then try to get to this. I'm tied to my, the model I live with my whole life. So if there's a different one that might do it better, I'm wide open to that. But the way I think about that is the individuals who have to fight are the ones in the fleet and the FMF. And so they have to be able to judge readiness. They do it routinely. You pick the system, you pick the systems, you pick the groups to get them ready to fight. They have one. Two is they have to be able to assess it. And that means the leaders have to be smart on it. I talked about that earlier. And it's a lot easier to be smart on, how I shoot torpedoes or how I shoot missiles or how I defend against ballistic, whatever the case might be, because we've been doing that for all our life, than this area. But I think that has to be put together. That's where I would start. And you can pick the numbers, whether it's, M1 through 4 or whatever the case might be, and then have the courage to call it M4 when a unit or a group or a fleet, is down in that regard. And what does that mean? Because that gets everybody's attention, that I've got to get them up to a much higher level. And then you back that up into the C2 level, the M2 level when you're not deployed or whatever the case might be. That's one thing. And then from we do have in all the services, we have modernization programs, not for everything for sure, but I think we need to think through in this threat, how would we modernize these systems, which we're going to use for a long time. It would be a fool's errand to just make the cutoff at the acquisition point now and say, okay, all future systems will be X, when we've got so many vulnerabilities tied to the systems that we know about, quite frankly, because we've been penetrated in the past, that we need to fix as well. So it takes, from my standpoint, on the readiness side, it takes the mindset of the warfighter. So it takes the fleet commanders, it takes the COCOMs to demand this output, which they do across many other requirements from a readiness standpoint, and then to back that up in the system. And the system will respond to that with those senior leaders demanding, hey, this is what we should do. And obviously there's an interface here for each of the services with their cyber fleets or their cyber units, if you will, that are responsible for the organized, train, and equip, let's say 10th Fleet, in the Navy. How are we doing that? And then how do you integrate that with the operational level COCOM? Here's how I'm going to fight, kind of thing.
Jim, any thoughts on that, or at this point, any final thoughts on this discussion, sir?
No, I think that Admiral Mullen did such a good job of describing it. All I want to do is thank you, General Reynolds, for your help in putting this together, and Admiral Mullen, thank you, and thank the audience for all they're doing for us.
Yeah, the visibility here is key, Laurie. And I shout it out to, because it's a birthday day. The other is I'm sitting here actually in New York. I'm going to do an event later on today for T-Mobile that is focused on Veterans Day. And they're sponsoring a group of their veterans, 100 or plus. They've flown in from all over the country. And T-Mobile's committed to hiring 10,000 veterans, and they're about halfway there. And I just want to applaud them, but also other, private sector companies, corporations, et cetera, who do so much for our veterans. It's a big deal. They are the best. They're loyal, timely, disciplined, all those things. They can make a huge difference. And so that's what the TMO sign is behind me. And thanks, Laurie, and thanks for the group for putting this on.
Gentlemen, thanks for a really great conversation. I think really insightful. I think, the bottom line, cybersecurity is national security, and it's a team sport. So the more that we can have these conversations and bring industry and DoD and others to the fight together, I think the better off we'll be. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and happy Veterans Day to all as well.
Thanks, Laurie.
And once again, we thank all three of you, Lieutenant General Laurie Reynolds, and happy birthday. Marines, 246 years old, most impressive. Admiral Mullen and Jim Rosenthal, we thank you all very, very, very much for your continued support. It was pretty good stuff, huh?
Fantastic. Thank
Yeah,
you,
it
Admiral.
really was.
So yeah, this was our only Marine
Right?
on the
Right.
birthday, and we thought they
Right.
deserved a day off. But we do appreciate one of them
Okay, yes.
taking that duty to be with us today, because they're all doing things to celebrate the 246th birthday.
That's right. And then Veterans Day coming up tomorrow. So it's a busy week.
It's a busy week.
Indeed it is. And of course, this is America's Future Series, our national security, cyber, land, air, sea, space symposium. And delighted to have you all here. We're going to be here for another 5 or 6 hours. So call your friends, tell the neighbors, and we'd love to have you be a part of all that we have to share with you during the course of the afternoon. So are you ready to move on?
I'm ready to move on.
All right. Major General Bo Young is going to come back and join us. Major General, are you there, sir? Trust me,
Yes,
he's coming
indeed,
up.
I am here. Sorry about
deal.
that.
No, not a
Operator
problem.
error on the mute button.
We've all been there, sir. Believe me, not a problem at all. It's all yours. Take it away.
Well, I don't know if our next guest is with us or not yet. We're waiting on Garrett Yee, Major General Yee, a good friend of mine, and I think we might have. Why don't we maybe take a 5-minute break?
Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break.
We can do whatever works for you. That's fine, sir.
That
Not a
sounds great.
problem.
And
Yeah.
before we sign off, sir, we'll let you go now. We'll come back in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'll be right here.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
But I wanted to touch on something that was said a moment ago about T-Mobile hiring 10,000 vets halfway
Right,
there, all that.
Right.
A lot of people aren't necessarily happy with their culture. They think maybe there's maybe a lack of urgency in their workforce. People maybe not be as whatever. If you want to change the culture for the good, put a Marine in the room. If you're, if you've got people that can't show up because they haven't had 3 lattes yet or whatever, they're fixing to go work, like they say in Texas or whatever. You want a little protect. You want somebody on time, shows up prepared, stays to the end, doesn't watch the clock.
You
is
sound
mission focused.
You sound just like our friend Don Graves,
No.
96-year-old Iwo Jima veteran, World War II, member of the Marines. And I was with him last week in an event we were doing in preparing and then doing an interview in preparation for Veterans Day coming up tomorrow. And you verbatim almost said exactly what he said about what made him proud to be a Marine, even as a 17, 18, 19-year-old until today. Now he's 96.
Yeah.
And
They're a good
that's
influence on any
interesting.
culture.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
No question about it.
Okay. We'll let you guys take a little break. Hopefully
Yeah.
get a sandwich, stretch your legs, come back, tell your friends.
See you in a couple of minutes.